Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Hey, everybody. Hope you're off to a great day wherever you are. I'm really excited for our conversation today. I'm always excited for our conversations, but I'm really excited to speak with Hollie McKay, war reporter Hollie McKay, who just recently returned from Ukraine. It's a really good day to take a deep breath and talk to Hollie about what her reporting was like inside Ukraine, what it was like to actually leave Ukraine, the complicated nature of that decision to leave, and also now at this point with a few days to step back and think about all that she learned during that time. So we're going to bring Hollie in just a moment. In the meantime, President Biden is actually heading overseas today, and he's going to start a very significant trip, which is going to be meeting with NATO allies. And in the past several weeks, we've seen different cabinet members do this, but the president traveling overseas really matters. So we'll watch the beginnings of those meetings. We're already getting reports that we could hear from NATO more troops in different strategic areas, move to these strategic areas to firm up NATO's front against Russia. And they would not put it that way because that sounds more combative, but there's clearly some strategic thinking going into where to put additional troops, additional resources. And one of the great questions you had for Hollie was how much NATO's efforts thus far have been affecting, in any way, positive or negative, the war in Ukraine. So before we get to all of that, I want to show you, as we always do, just to look at the maps and give us an idea of what does it look like from a bird's eye view of Ukraine at this very moment. The BBC has done a great job of this. They're using some resources from the Institute of the Study of War. And so what you can see here on your screen is what Ukraine looked like about a week ago, and you can see what it looks like now. And you might just look at these two maps, and the big takeaway is it doesn't really look that different. You still are seeing Russia in particular strategic areas along the north. Remember, Russia has a strong alliance with Belarus, which is also up there. And we've talked a lot, and I'm so glad that we have, about how important the strategic waterways are in the south of Ukraine. Remember, at the very south of Ukraine, that's Crimea, that's a peninsula that Russia annexed in 2014. And you had these disputed territories along the east, but cities like Mariupol, for example, although close to those areas of dispute, were a free and functioning city 6 weeks ago, and now is under really bombardment by Russia. Why are these strategic areas? Because this is one of the key ways that Russia is able to get resources out of Russia into the Black Sea and then into the broader oceans. And we know that Russia really needs to export things like grain and like oil to keep their economy going. So this is not just about the war that's taking place in Ukraine right now, but also, like we talked about with Sal, who's our maritime historian that we just did an interview with, about economic warfare. And that's why we're seeing these particular areas in focus. Let me just show you a few other things. There's so much focus on Kyiv, and we'll talk to Hollie about this. I know this map is really big, but I want you to see where the presidential office is. You can see the areas around Kyiv continue to be areas of tension, and we've received a couple reports as of late that it doesn't seem that Russia's been able to make some of the advances that they've wanted to thus far. So we'll talk to Hollie about this map. Unfortunately, I can't bring up the map, so I also have a guest. That would be great because I'd love her to walk us through it. Here's another closer look at the south. Again, there's Crimea. And again, you can see Russian forces. One of the things that we've heard from the Pentagon is this thinking that Russian forces may move up from the south, the north, and the east and try to really encircle Kyiv. And so you can see specifically these areas, Mariupol being one of them, that remains a really big focus. Final map here. You cannot replace this. Here's a closer look at Mariupol. So you do see areas of the city that are not under Russian control. According to reports, about 100,000 people in the city remain there. Of course, we're relying on the best information we have coming out at this time, which is difficult. Again, something that we can talk to Hollie about. The British Defense Ministry today gave an assessment of Russia. And what they said is that Russian forces are static at this time. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean they're just taking a pause before they try a different strategy? We don't really know what that means. And quite frankly, status quo is also not good, right? So let's talk a little bit more about all of this with Holly. I'm going to see if I can go ahead and bring her in here. I see a lot of you on. It's great to see you guys. Dale, great to see you. And great to see you as well. If you'd like to ask questions live, I'd love to bring you in on video. I just invited Holly in. So let's go see if we can get Holly. There she is.
Hey.
Holly back stateside. We've been waiting to talk to you, Holly. It's so great to see you. How does it feel to be back?
I don't know. I haven't, yeah, always mixed things. Yeah, I don't know. I still want to be there, but I also recognize that it's not always viable to be there unless things are kind of progressing, which the story itself sort of is fairly stagnant right now. So it's just sort of a matter of determining when the appropriate time is to sort of go back, that I can be of most use. That's always a struggle of being an independent journalist. You don't have the endless resources to kind of just sit around the hotel every day. It's not my job to read wire copy or, be necessarily, speaking live shots from a hotel roof. So for me to be there, the story has to be kind of advancing, and I have to feel that I have the resources to push that forward. And I felt that I had done sort of the most that I could at this particular chapter. As most of you probably know, I was also there sort of January, February. So it's been a bit of a long sort of progression, and it may end up just one of the conflicts similar to other ones I've covered in Iraq and Syria and things in the past, where it is just sort of a matter of going in and out, at strategic times, as opposed to, I don't sort of have the resources to kind of just live there. So I think that I have to be strategic about how I can cover it.
Well, and I've seen now with you also with the conflict in Afghanistan, how difficult these decisions are. And we're in pretty close contact through the times that you're overseas. I probably ask you too many questions at certain times just to see how you are, but also to learn from your reporting. But I know that it's something very unique to a war reporter, someone that's very dedicated to the story. There's such an emotional component of not wanting to leave, because you don't want to leave the story. Not only do you not want to leave the story, but you don't want to leave the people. And that's something that Jean was asking about. And I thought it was such a great question that goes to this point, which is, what did you feel? Like, what were you feeling in the moment that you said, you know what, now is the time that I probably should at least take a break?
Yeah, so I think my concerns were not necessarily from the danger point of view. That's something I'm very used to, and that's not a huge factor in my decision making. It's more, I felt that if the communications went down, which they had gone down in other cities surrounding Kiev, Mariupol, and Kharkiv, other places that the Russians have really attacked, me being there would not even sort of be of use, because I would not be able to get any information out, which sort of defeats the purpose of being a journalist kind of on the ground there in real time. I had to sort of just weigh in the fact that, again, I don't sort of, a lot of the resources that I sort of relied on in the past, when I would sort of go back to them about, what the exit plans were, and, they wanted to charge me a lot of money, which I just don't have. So I also felt that I had to take the train while it was still running, because that was really just a viable thing. And it was unclear how long the train would be running for. Obviously still running now, but we don't know, at what point that continues or it doesn't. So there's just sort of a lot of factors. It was sort of going into another long-term lockdown, which means you can't even leave the hotel. Which again, there's only very limited reporting you can do if you're unable to leave the room that you're in. So I think just a lot of factors that sort of went into it, and I felt that it was probably at a time when a lot of journalists were also taking a break. That particular week, a lot of colleagues and things who'd been there sort of since January as well, had decided that they were going to sort of step out for a little bit too. So it sort of seemed a bit of a lull, and it's always a really, really difficult decision for me to make, because I want to be able to just be there. And I just have to recognize that I don't have sort of the endless resources to do that. And I need to be where I'm most effective. I need, you do need rest to make sure that you do make the best decisions that you can possibly make in these situations. So yeah, it's never an easy decision, and part of me still regrets the decision, but it is what it is. And um, I can't live in a place as much as I would love to. And I think it was interesting. So I think we talked about a little bit last time I was on, but when I got my burns and I was going to this mobile hospital to get treatment, and at that point it was sort of fairly bad at that time, and the lovely lady who was treating me, the nurse, and my mum was on the speakerphone, and she had her daughter who was in London, and so my mother was crying because she was worried, and her daughter was crying because she was in London and worried about her mum. So it was just sort of this funny situation, and she sort of looked at me and she said, you should leave when you can. She said, this is our war. And it's not something I'd really thought about before, but I think, to a degree, we do get attached to things and we do feel very obliged to cover things. But at the same time, it just gave me a pause for thought. And I thought, this is certain, at times you have to at times Ukrainian journalists have to kind of take the reins. And certainly if this was something that was happening in the US or Australia, of which I'm both a dual citizen of, there is no question that I would not be going anywhere. But I do have to recognize that sometimes that just it isn't my war, and I have to know when I can step away.
Isn't that funny that there's those moments where someone says something to you like that? This is our war, and it's just like it shakes you into that moment of thinking, okay, I'm going to remember that. I'm going to remember that conversation. A lot of our audience wants to know about your mom, actually, Hollie. That was one of the big questions we got, which was, what does Hollie's family feel about? How is it for her family to know that she's in a war zone? And just because I offer some clarification, because we could have some new people here, when Hollie was speaking about her burns, these were burns that she got in basically an accident in the hotel. Hollie, you can explain it if you like, but just so that we're clear that it wasn't from being mid-report somewhere on the scene.
Yeah, so yeah, my parents I think they found they sort of used to it, but also not used to it. I don't know if they could ever get used to it. So my family's all in Sydney. I've got my parents there, and also my sister and my nieces, and everybody is in Australia. So I'm the only one in the US. So they are used to it. I think for them, Ukraine probably felt a little bit closer to home, not necessarily geographically, but something that they could maybe relate to a little bit more than, say, a lot of the other places that I've worked in the past that just sort of seem too far and too remote. So I think for them, they certainly had a very vested interest in sort of covering the conflict, and I think really kind of understanding it maybe in a different way before. And I think it was, certainly difficult for them, knowing, as my sister tells me, my dad didn't sleep at all, and he was so worried, and he was planning on how he was going to get to Ukraine if I got injured, and just very sweet parent stuff. My dad is 71. So it just, I mean, I think that they understand the work and they see the importance of it, but it certainly is a challenge for them to know when I'm in these situations. And I think after several journalists that were killed, and a lot of people sort of getting killed in places that I had spent a lot of time in, certainly uncomfortable for them, but they don't try to necessarily stop me, or never necessarily tell me that I have to leave, or they're usually very supportive, but I try to honor that it is difficult, and that certainly weighs into decision making as well. Is I don't want to put my family through extra stress if I don't feel that it's necessary for me to be in a situation.
You mentioned the journalists that were killed. I know you knew Pierre. Is there anything that you think our audience should know about Pierre?
Just, Pierre was, he'd been at Fox for a really long time, and he was someone that I sort of communicated with daily, and I sort of planned to evacuate when he was going to leave and things like that. So after he was killed, it did change the dynamics of me sort of losing a support system there. But I think one thing to always really remember is, I think we often look at reporters as really the faces of stories, but so often it really just is the camera people who are just, and this isn't just war stories, this is really any story that you are covering anyway. um, Camera people, just the cameramen, the camera women, they know usually more about a situation than anybody else. They are, the go-to for logistics. They're the go-to for understanding the big picture. They just, they don't get the credit because they behind the scenes. But yet they're, usually of the entire team, even sometimes often more than the producer, they have a lot more knowledge. So yeah, I have tremendous respect for cameramen and women, just because I really think, and Pierre was absolutely the epitome of that. He had been doing this sort of coverage for decades and had been in every conflict and everywhere in the world, and everybody just adored working with him. And I think there's people in life that you encounter that are just very pure souls, and he was definitely one of them. Just not a mean word to say about anybody, extremely kind, just loved what he did, just extreme passion for every story and every person. And I think it's just, yeah, it's a huge loss, because he was just someone who was just so wonderful and so great at what he did.
It's an important perspective to remember the photojournalists that are in so many different parts of the world, and even inside the studio. There usually are a crew. Normally, it's the majority are men. Not that there are women, but the majority of men. And I certainly had some more senior photojournalists that always watched out for me, Holly. And it sounds like Pierre was one of those for you as well. Kind of, they watch out. They watch out for some people. You would like to be on that side of things. But they're also always listening. And that's something that's so important in journalism. Someone that's listening and watching and not always doing the talking, which really matters. It really matters. That's one of the questions that we've received a lot of. And I know we've talked a little bit about it, so I'd like to hit it dead on. There's been a lot of questions, and I want to be clear about this. Smarter News is a place where I want to embrace questions and curiosity. And sometimes I get some notes from our audience, and they're actually a little bit afraid because they've heard something maybe from a source that they know maybe is one that they shouldn't trust, but it leads to a couple other questions for them. And the questions that I've seen come through recently is just, Jenna, how can we trust that we know what's happening in Ukraine? How do we trust the information that's actually on the ground? Do we know? I mean, the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians are doing this, and can we really confirm that the Russians are wrong? There is a chaos that comes in conflict and war. One of the reasons that we rely on photojournalists, and one of the reasons why we've developed the relationship, is that you're actually there, which matters. But can you speak to that a little bit about how you navigate that? Really trying to find reliable information on the ground, and also speak to our audience about what they could be hearing about what is or is not happening inside Ukraine.
Yeah, I think it's important to know sort of where you're getting your information from to begin with. And I know that there is a lot of distrust of mainstream media, but when it comes to kind of conflicts on the ground, you have to look at the BBC and CNN and Fox and other people that actually have teams. And I think that when it comes to these international stories, people really risk their life to be there. They're not getting any necessarily gain by being in a war zone to spread fake information. So I think that a lot of that skepticism is really overblown, and it is upsetting to me when I get so many comments like, I don't believe anyone that's there. And I think, you know what, that's easy enough for you to say from the comfort of your home on being a keyboard warrior. There are a lot of amazing journalists and camera people and producers and writers and whoever else, photographers, who are over there right now trying to deliver the news. So for you to just dismiss it like that is a little bit, sort of says more about you than it says about the people doing the work. So I think it's important to recognize where the sort of source is coming from. And I also think that, for me, it's just, I'm a one-man band generally, so I'm not necessarily going to be the person that's going to be giving you satellite feeds, drone footage, and all of that. That's not I can't verify that for you. But what I can do is verify, accounts on the ground. I can show you what's happening. I can walk you through. I can introduce you to the mother who's left behind her 2 children. I can talk to the presidential advisor who is there that's sort of saying XYZ, and do my best to sort of deliver those first-hand accounts. And that's the role that I can play. I can't speak to things that I can't see. But, even in this particular situation, when I was in Ukraine, I'd post a picture and then suddenly these trolls would come out and say, that's a deep fake. And I just thought, I can't argue with that.
Is that typical? I mean, and let's ask, you've been obviously in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, you've been all over the world. Is that typical? Is it a typical reaction, or is that new?
I think, I certainly think it's gotten worse. I did see it a lot in Afghanistan. And I think that's an evolution of technology and where we are. In conflicts in the past, it wasn't as bad. I don't think we had, so much of a quote unquote fake news phenomena, back when I was in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and other places. Whereas I think Afghanistan is really, with the fall last year, is really where I started to see this sort of chaos, and sort of this information game. And it was funny because so much of the information that initially that was even coming out that was, very anti-Taliban information, so to speak, it was just fake. It was just sort of incorrect news. And so when I would try to point to some of this incorrect news, nobody was really interested. None of the outlets I worked for that I pitched these stories to really, they cared if the Taliban was fake news or it wasn't. But here it was sort of a bit of a different dynamic. And it was a lot more chaotic, I think. Certainly what I've seen is Ukraine really, so many amazing journalists being on the ground and so many amazing humanitarians and things. But I also saw this really dark side of it too, where suddenly it was sort of a free-for-all for people that had never had any combat journalism experience or weren't really even journalists. But I think, say, the difference between Afghanistan and Ukraine, Afghanistan, you had to have a visa. You had to, you couldn't just roll up to Kabul and walk in. So that sort of limited the pool of crazy that could get into the country. Whereas in Ukraine, because you don't need a visa and things like that, you sort of had every wild person from wherever they were coming from crossing borders to kind of get in without restriction. And so what I noticed that sort of created this sort of cesspool of a lot of very unprofessional quote unquote journalism. A lot of people that I felt were going there just to try to make a buck or to be quote unquote truth tellers to YouTube that really I felt didn't have business being there. And that also factored into my decision that I felt a lot of the times these situations became incredibly unsafe. I remember being on the Irpine Bridge one day and sort of going into the city and coming back and being like, there's a lot more Russian control than what, even the Ukrainians want you to believe. And Russians had really pushed forward. I noticed the change within the span of 2 days. And, saying to a bunch of these people, I wouldn't go into that city if I was you, that's a big risk. And yet, I would see these young people just get in abandoned cars, no body armor, off they go into the city. Just complete sort of disregard for their own lives and as well as the lives of sort of people around them. And it felt really disgusting at a point. I remember at one point too when there were a lot of evacuations happening at the bridge, and it was just really the most vulnerable people. They were sort of disabled. There were people coming in wheelbarrows, people that were old, just people that were just incredibly traumatized. Some of them would be covered in blood, and they'd been in their bunker for 10 days maybe, had no food, electricity, and just so incredibly traumatized. And I would just sort of see these flock of people that would just shove cameras in their faces, shove iPhones in their faces, start screaming questions at them. No permission. No, can I speak to you? Can I take your picture? I really understand the need to get stories out, but I'm always, you're a human before you're a journalist. And I believe very much in having that tact and respect for people, especially people that are suffering. So, I sort of witnessed this for a couple of days, and it really made me question a lot of things. It made me sort of concerned for what journalism had sort of become, and this sort of free for all, and there's not really anything I can single handedly do about it, but it just, to me, it did feel, it felt very icky. And I also
Right.
that a lot in terms of all these quote unquote humanitarian groups that are there. I know groups that have been posting pictures of themselves with operating at an operating table saying they're in Ukraine when they're not even there. I mean, they're physically in Ukraine, but they're not doing the picture that they're showing of a surgery was never taken in Ukraine. They're sitting around doing nothing. I'm seeing people that are, supposedly, doing XYZ, really, quite frankly, doing nothing. I'm seeing people raise absolutely millions of dollars on these GoFundMe campaigns, and I question a lot of the time, what is happening with any of that money, and where is it going, and who is it going to? And I just, again, the same sort of thing that I saw with the journalism pool, I see it in this sort of humanitarian pool, or whatever you may want to call it. And I just think, it's really important for people to donate to legitimate NGOs. Even if 100% of the funding isn't necessarily going to the cause, because there is overhead, but places like the ICRC, local places that I've mentioned before, the Pirogov Mobile Hospital, places that have got a track record for knowing how to work in these environments and have accountability. That is where, I would suggest to people who want to help. Don't just go to somebody's GoFundMe campaign to spend. I saw somebody who'd raised tens of thousands of dollars to go and fight, and they had no experience fighting and belonged to some sort of white supremacy group. So I just really do your research. Don't just go throwing money to GoFundMe, because there are an extreme amount of opportunists out there. It's sad to say, but that's something that I've, since I've come back and reflected a little bit, that it's made me pretty angry, to be
Yeah,
honest.
I'm sure. I'd love it, Holly, maybe after we're done, if you want to email me the exact links to
Yeah,
who you've worked with, then I can put it in the caption.
yeah,
And that way, because we get that question very often, people do want to help, and how to do it the right way. And I'm sure they would really appreciate your advice on that. It's interesting as you're talking, seeing a lot of different comments, people mentioning, oh yeah, I saw these images on TikTok, and then, the images are not from Ukraine.
yeah,
And you think, well, social media has this incredible ability to bring us right into a war. We're able to speak to you live in Kyiv because of social media. At the same time, it's also ignited a lot of questions because of the spread, or the lack of responsibility of the spread of different images. And so let's now just turn to your experience on the ground, which is what we want to elevate, right? Which is, and all of your thoughts on that, I think, are so valuable about journalism and humanitarian groups. I've certainly seen that in the nonprofit world related to the military as well. But Kathy had a great question, and she was asking, what are you most struck by when you were in the midst of everything? And now that you've had a couple days, not that long, to reflect, like, what are you most struck by about the reality on the ground in Ukraine?
I mean, it doesn't sound like the most profound thing at all, but what sort of fascinates me is how quickly humans adapt to war, how overnight, how things can just turn upside down overnight. So when as it was in this situation where you had the tension, but nobody was sort of sure if anything was going to happen, and then all of a sudden, boom, the invasion happens, land, sea, air, um, everything shuts down. Suddenly, you're hearing artillery bombardments constantly, air raid sirens are going off, you're going to a bunker, there's no more work, there's no more school, there's no more shops opened, your streets are full of checkpoints, there's this, everything changes in an instant. How quickly human beings adapt to that. And that's something that fascinated me. And just how quickly it changed. And I even found myself, like, on the nights that were a little bit quieter, where I couldn't hear so much shelling and artillery, like almost feeling uncomfortable, because I was like, I can't hear any, I can't hear any rockets right now. Is this a bad sign? So it just it's fascinating how quickly we adapt to change, and in, even change that's horrific like that, but just in, the refugee flow, just everything is the same. And yet, I just, human beings and the Ukrainians just sort of accept it and take it, and fight and push through it. But but to me, it's just on a psychological level. I think about it a lot. I think how are entire populations, millions of people, just able to adapt like that in an instant. And I think it shows you, a certain degree of resilience and willingness to sort of fight and keep up the fight. But just even those that aren't on the front line, just how quickly, people can mobilize and come together and find a place, in this.
A great question came from Arabelle. She said, "Does it seem like the U.S. and the NATO support is working? What do you see? What are you hearing from
Yeah.
Ukrainian sources? What do you think about that?"
I mean, obviously, if we're looking at the way that Ukraine has so far has sort of been able to keep Russia out from a lot of the major cities, such as the capital, then you could look at that and sort of say the support is obviously having some positive impact. I think that the javelins and the stingers and the anti tank and anti missile aircraft, I think that has a really had a sort of a profound effect on it. I think that as much as NATO can continue to support that, as much as possible for Ukraine, I think maybe there was a little bit of an overestimation from the intelligence community in how quickly, everybody thought Russia was going to just come in and take the country essentially and take the capital. And that obviously we're a month into it now and that hasn't happened. So I think, maybe the support that the US provided in the initial stages or even before the invasion, isn't wasn't hasn't sort of matched the holdout ability. I think if the U.S. assessments had kind of been able to sort of reconcile the Ukrainians' ability to defend and even go on the offensive in some cases, then perhaps the U.S. and other countries would have provided more equipment to them in the lead up. But that hasn't. Now that that's sort of a month in, I think that's something that the US is going to have to continue to try to double down on as much as possible. And obviously, Russians are now targeting any of those thoroughfares or weapons depots. So there is an extra challenge now in order to get those weapons and things where they need to be. But I certainly think that there was an underestimation there, so to speak, that hopefully needs to be reconciled. That's really all the Ukrainians have against against this Russian air power. And Russians may not, they've certainly proved themselves to be inept in many ways, but at the end of the day, they still have a large amount of troops, and they still have access to very advanced missile systems and aircraft.
I mentioned to everyone that usually we like to go 30 minutes with the conversation with the permission of our audience, and with your permission, Hollie, I'm going to continue because we have a lot more questions. And I just got a great one, which was, have you ever met President Zielinski? Have you interacted with him or any other high-ranking government officials?
Friends of mine that are very close aides of his. So I haven't met him personally, but I sort of interacted in the same kind of circles and things, and with people that are very close to him. So
the reason why I asked that is that a topic of conversation, kind of getting back to what the reality is on the ground versus what is also being reported or floated in American media. And we actually got a question about this related to Fox News and Tucker Carlson. And if we chase every single opinion commentator out there, we'll never get the time to actually hear about what's happening on the ground. But I do think this is important. There's been a consistent question about whether or not the Ukrainian government, because of the corruption that has been endemic in the country, is a trustworthy partner, and whether or not we're actually interacting with a government that is like-minded. There's been commentary on conservative media about this, but quite frankly, other places as well. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that, about what do you think we should consider when we hear that sort of perspective?
I mean, I think you also have to weigh in that, we focus a lot on the Russian propaganda, which is obviously huge, and but I also, we have to acknowledge that Ukraine does have its own sort of propaganda wing as well, and I think that and I understand, in a time of war, they're trying to sort of create these unification campaigns and sort of heroic stories, and that is all sort of an important part of the way that they're projecting an image. But I also think, you also have to look at that with a little bit of skepticism at the same time. You have to also recognize that, Ukraine has its certain agenda that it wants to put forward. It doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but sometimes you'll find you sort of only have to look at. I guess there's a massive focus, for example, on Russian soldier casualties, which Ukraine constantly sort of pushes this narrative of 14,000 soldiers dead, but we don't hear about how many Ukrainian soldiers are dead. I think there was a brief comment that was made a few days ago about, perhaps there being about 1,300, but that's something Ukraine has very much kept under wraps because that would be damaging to its morale of its country, of its soldiers. So it's not necessarily that the information's wrong. It's just that each, certain sides are going to highlight certain things and exaggerate in some cases. And it's just always to be mindful of that there is fog of war for a reason, and that when it comes to statistics and things, you're never going to get an absolutely accurate number. The US doesn't really have presence in, say, a place like Mariupol, and neither does the United Nations or any of these other sort of bodies that generally we look to for statistics. So you just sort of have to bear in mind that this is sort of a fog of war situation, and that you may be able to kind of get rough estimates, but you're never going to be able to sort of pinpoint exactly, certain death tolls or certain the casualties or things like that. So that's just part and parcel with any conflict. That's not necessarily unique to Ukraine. So I just think, each sort of always just bear in mind everybody has a certain, I guess, agenda that they want to put forward. I think I can't really speak to the Tucker Carlson stuff because I haven't actually watched any of it, and I've just really seen the headlines and things. But
there's two. I could really kind of group two lines of commentary into like two buckets. You have a line of commentary in America that is, we shouldn't be involved in this at all. This is Ukraine's war. It's terrible, but we're maybe going too far down the road of support. I put that into one bucket. The other bucket is, we are already in World War III, and we are not doing enough, and we need a no-fly zone, and America needs to be more aggressive. So you actually have both sides of the pendulum. Hey, these guys aren't trustworthy. We shouldn't do anything with them. To, hey, this is the future of Europe. We better align ourselves pretty quick. And I mean, you can't. I enjoy commentary and opinions. It's one of the ways that we really exercise freedom of expression and freedom of the press. So I don't want to quiet, but the pendulum is wide there, Holly.
Yeah.
Between those two sides,
I recognize, that's something that makes America, a unique place, is that I can understand, as much as I can understand definitely the point of view of feeling that we need to do more, that the US has the ability to do more and can do more, but I also recognize, that we've been in different wars in different countries, really, Afghanistan 20 years and Iraq a really long time, and that we've gotten involved in different places. And I certainly, people question the money spent there, the lives spent there, and I think they're valid questions as well. How much does the US want to be involved in foreign places? I think, Ukraine changed the dynamic a lot more because you are dealing with a nuclear power, as opposed to places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where you weren't dealing conflict with a nuclear power. And certainly nukes make that they are right in anything we go into, and I think if anything, this bolsters a lot of countries who maybe been teetering on the edge of wanting to be a nuclear power. This certainly is something that's going to make a lot of countries reassess, is this the only way to deter something like this? I mean, they look at Ukraine, who gave up its nuclear, who had I think the third biggest arsenal in the world after the fall of the Soviet Union, and basically gave their weapons up under the conditions that Russia was going to respect their independence, and also that other countries would come to their savior if necessary. And as you can kind of see, since now they're sort of being bullied by a nuclear power, and you can question the role of the US, who signed this Budapest Memorandum, as it was called. Are we doing enough to come to their defense based on our sort of pushing of them to give up their nukes back in the day? So I think there are a lot of sort of implications and questions that arise from this. And I think, look at, we could look at
Well,
it.
let me just interrupt you, but like, is that foreign policy? We could debate it forever,
Yeah.
and that's why you have talk shows that go on for hours about this on any radio station across America and any numerous television stations. What you don't see is people really putting an hour on TV talking to your average Ukrainian, which you have actually done, and you have actually talked to Ukrainians that are just like us. You know that 2 months ago, kind of heard things could happen, but they've been hearing that for years. That suddenly are finding themselves in the middle of war and are trying to escape for their lives.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that. Tell us about some of the people that you met and what they had to say.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really impossible situation for people. I think there's frustration on many levels in terms of people who have been wounded and shot and had their house shelled, that try to send pictures or relay what's happening to friends and family in Russia, and they don't believe them. They, you're lying. This is not happening. This is not true. And it's hard to wrap our heads around that happening even in the 21st century, how that is possible. So I think, that is also a huge frustration for Ukrainians in going through this. And I think that's something that upsets me a lot too, when I get, and there is a lot of it in the US too. I still get people, in the US who are still themselves. I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's hard to imagine what it's like to really just have to leave your home, to be living, in the middle of a cold freeze in a bunker with no food and no heating and electricity. And just everyone I met just had sort of a horrific war story, whether it be, when the Russians come to take over their place, the first thing that they generally do is take their phones from them. And then they steal their food and they steal their clothes. And it's just this sort of very callous and terrifying situation. And almost everyone I talked to that was coming out of these humanitarian corridors was shot at, So it's really just a.
Does that give you perspective, Holly? Because I think we can hear that. I think we can watch it. But the thought that next week I could be packing up my house and trying to get out of Austin, Texas with my children, like, I mean, I can't even imagine that. You know what I mean? Has it changed the way that you feel about your own security, about how quickly life can change, and has that highlighted the vulnerability, I guess, that we could all feel at a certain time?
And certainly something that can happen. It can happen anywhere, and I think sometimes we think, obviously, in the United States, we aren't surrounded by a nuclear power or sort of autocracy, but I think that it's something that can happen anywhere, and I think that security is a fleeting concept to a degree, and I think even, I don't want to get political on this too much, but I was talking to an American that was there that was sort of doing some volunteering, and he was from California, and he sort of said that it changed his view a lot of the Second Amendment, because I think we also hear a lot, how could you ever have a AR-15 that was going to stand up to some
Whatever.
whatever.
Yeah.
But it just sort of goes to show you that the sort of the willingness, and that there is impact in that. There is impact in making a Molotov cocktail. There is degrees to which civilians can all play a part should a conflict by a much larger adversary erupt. And so I think it gives you a little bit of pause for thought of how much do we want to be constantly relying on the government. And I guarantee if America is at war and something happens to you in your home, nobody's coming when you call 911. Then that goes to say for ambulances, for first responders in any capacity, we have to be a certain degree self-sufficient, certain degree, and we have to also look at how much responsibility we put on other entities as opposed to what things that we can do in our own environment to protect and defend ourselves. And I think it's just it's a pause for thought, because certainly Ukraine wasn't a place that it really ever saw this happening. I think that obviously there has been the war in the East, but that was sort of confined to a few areas, and I think that there was just never, I guess, in many parts, people just never really thought that Putin would do this, that there was just always going to be too much at stake for this to happen, and then it did, and just like that, you're in a situation. But I will say, Ukrainians are, one of the few countries in Europe probably that had had a spirit to a degree of Second Amendment spirit, so to speak. So had a degree of wanting to, people were able to own firearms. There wasn't really huge restrictions on it the way there is in most countries. People went to different civil defense training courses. So there certainly was this sort of spirit of wanting to play a part and self-protection. So they weren't sort of going from zero. Whereas I think in a lot of countries in Europe, and I was reading somewhere, I think it was in, I can't remember which country it was exactly, I think it may be Slovakia, but they were also now having to go back and look at their, what restrictions they had on people being able to kind of defend themselves as well. So there's going to be a lot of people that would disagree with that assessment. And before, it's not meant to be a political assessment. It's just
No.
meant to be what we can do as individuals to be responsible as individuals, therefore responsible in a collective sense.
Yeah, well, your point's well taken. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I want to share this in a very small way. I grew up in the city, always lived in an apartment, never lived in a house, never lived in an actual house until I was 37 years old. Mm-hmm. And the first house that I moved into in Texas was way out in the country. And I was talking to the pediatrician. I had 2 little kids, and I said, well, what do I do if my kid was bit by a snake? Because they're snakes. And I said, do I call the ambulance? He's like, no, the ambulance isn't coming. And I'm like, what? There was no police force. I never lived anywhere where there's no police force, where like if I dialed 911, I would hear an ambulance. I never lived anywhere like that. He's like, you better get in your car and you better drive to the hospital. And it was a kind of this wake up call of, oh, I've assumed so much because I hear the sirens all the time. I like the sound of sirens. It's actually harder for me to fall asleep when you don't hear the noise of the city.
Yeah.
But it was a real wake-up call of if something goes down, it's me, myself, and I, and my 2 little kids. So I'm going to have to change some. And by the way, that did change a lot about how we lived and how we thought about preparation, at least for me. My husband was more used for that. He's been trained by American taxpayer dollars because he was in the military.
Well, there, but
it's true. It's true. And even when we're talking about really scary scenarios, we're talking about nuclear war. We've talked about that in recent. We're talking about cyber attacks. Like, what could that look like? And I think sometimes and listen, it's for me too, a hesitancy to talk too much about that because it's so frightening. I think there's also a need to talk about it because we also have to be very clear-eyed about the evils of the world and the threats that we can face. And we can do that in America, where we can have open conversations about this, where a lot of places you cannot. And so it's definitely on my list of things to do. I've gotten a lot of questions about that. I know it's a scary topic, but I think even just a little talk about it here, Hollie, was good. You got a really interesting perspective about how hard it is. And you did it, and you did it with grace. I don't know how you do all this. It's the reality of what it takes to leave Ukraine, because you did it just like everybody else. You didn't hop in a van with your news crew. You had to figure out a way out of Ukraine in the matter of just a few hours.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience, because it's what so many families are experiencing as well.
And I went to the main sort of train station, and there was just it was packed, with people, mostly women and children, obviously, because men can't leave. So I went, and there's this sign with train times, but it doesn't really work like that. Trains just come when they feel like it. So I think the sign sort of said he was going to arrive at one time, and then 3 hours later, I'm still standing there. And so then the train comes, and you sort of just have to kind of like run to the train because it's unclear whether everybody's going to be able to fit on or not. So I was able to sort of get on this train, and there was no idea how long the train was going to take. There was just nothing. There was no information. And so you sort of I was able to find a seat, and there's no food. And because I'd sort of made quite a last minute decision, I hadn't been very prepared. I didn't have water or food or anything. So basically, as it turned out, I think it was almost like 15 hours or something. So there's like no food, no water, no toilets. Everybody's just sort of crammed. There are people sleeping in between the carriages. They're on the floor. It's just everybody's kind of shoved in. And for some reason, it was boiling hot too. And we're trying to open all the windows, but and it was a fairly slow train, but the route of the train, I guess, because of the situation, the route of the train would sort of go from Kiev here. It would go all the way down south and then start to go back up and west. So at one point, instead of just kind of being able to cross the country, you're on this sort of huge journey. So at one point you go all the way down, and then the train stops and then starts to go backwards again. So that sort of just shows you it just is this completely cross-country trip. And I think at one point it was actually the point where the train sort of stopped south before it started to go backwards again, where sort of a bunch of volunteers jumped on the train and were kind of handing out these sort of, I don't know what they were, like fried pieces of bread to people. So they were just volunteers that were there to help refugees. So I was kind of like, oh gosh, is there anything that was really the only sort of reprieve that we got. And then and so by the time I got to Lviv, it was, I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning or something. And there was sort of just, again, you're in a curfew situation. So there's no sort of cabs or things open. And so it was a little bit overwhelming and confusing. And then that's another 2 hours to try to get to the border. And so I was able to just find this stranger really who helped me. I was all over the map. So a stranger kind of helped me. He had a car that was coming, so I was able to get in a car with him that took to the border. And then you sort of get to the border. Again, it's sort of these early hours of the morning, and nobody had any really idea what was happening. It was like closed. The air raid sirens were going off, so that it was just kind of closed. Everybody's kind of walking toward this gate, and the people just yelling at me in Ukrainian. I didn't understand, and it was a little bit overwhelming. And then there's just masses of lines of people, and people just sort of sleeping on the floor, and nobody really kind of knows the process, and it isn't especially streamlined. So you sort of just have to be patient. And yeah, I just had to sort of line up with the people um, and sort of cross that way. And it's mostly just sort of women and babies. And then when you cross into the Poland side, there are just tons of people sleeping on floors and little mattresses. And it's just very it's sort of this very strange sort of dynamic. And I remember, I had a whole bunch of sort of Ukrainian money that I wanted to change, and I just I remember like getting to Poland and trying to change it, and the woman just sort of yelling at me and saying, "No, we don't want that money." And I just remember thinking, "Oh my goodness!" Like, for a lot of we can't change that money. I thought, "Oh my goodness, it's okay for me, but for people that are coming from Ukraine, that this is all they have, and now they're being told." You can't change this money. And just imagine that. Just if I felt overwhelmed by it, I'm sure that other people, I can only imagine the sort of the overwhelm that they felt with it all too. But I can also imagine, it is difficult for any country, including Poland, to just suddenly take in 3-4 million refugees, like boom, in a couple of weeks. And I think that is that would be overwhelming for America, a country of hundreds of millions, whereas Poland's a very small country. And so suddenly to have this massive influx in population, I also have to hand it to them as well, and a lot of the bordering countries and their ability to take people in and to be able to provide basic services and food and things like that. That's a big ask on those countries as well. And so it's wonderful that they're doing that, and things are never going to be just completely seamless.
Wow. One of the questions we've had from AR is, how do you stay safe? I mean, how did you make the call of like, okay, I'm going to get in the car with this guy, like totally don't know him, hope it works out. Like, how do you make those decisions?
I wish I had a better answer for you on that. I've spent much of my career, and even I wish I could be safe. I honestly, if I could be safe, I probably wouldn't be doing this job. I have to follow my intuition at times. I have to, follow my gut instinct. There have been many times where I've slept on the floor with strange people, and luckily for me, I've always been very blessed in I've always had great sort of people that have always taken care of me. I've never had a terribly bad situation or anything like that, but certainly I'm not here to do a stranger danger PSA.
You're like, that's a role I'm not going to be able to take.
The challenge about being, there are certainly an amazing advantages of being an independent journalist and a writer and things. I have freedom. I have so much freedom. I was out last night with a friend of mine who just retired from the military, who actually met. He was in Syria at the time. He was an SF guy. He was working in Syria, and he always laughs. He says, "Every person I know, every news crews that came to Syria, they were there with security and this and this." And they said, the next minute I look over and there's Holly rowing a boat across the Euphrates. Like literally, like we all just looked at that. We're like, "Oh my God, who is this?" So there are certain things that can be kind of. I enjoy the independence of it, but it's not the safest profession, certainly. And one thing this trip did make me realize is sort of the importance of a team, and that's something that why I also had to make that decision to leave, was because I didn't feel that I had a team of support. I felt, especially after Pierre was killed, I felt very much like I was very alone, and it was not a comfortable alone. It was alone, like if something happens and the comms go down, I have nobody right now.
Yeah.
And so, that has sort of reevaluated a lot of the thinking that I have in terms of, just having that one other person to share logistics, to share burden. Even if you have to sleep on a floor somewhere, you have someone that can watch your bag for you. Whereas, for me, if I'm sleeping on a floor somewhere, I'm like tying the bag around my head and trying to hide my money down my pants. And, it's a process. So I think that, yeah, there is something to be said, at least just having that teamwork. And that's something that, on trips going forward, that I will try to reassess where possible, because Ukraine was especially hard doing that alone in such a kinetic sort of war zone.
We have someone that's commenting that you must have a fleet of angels.
A
fleet of angels.
I do. I really do. Sometimes I look back and yeah, even just being in the situation I was, and having this stranger kind of take me under his wing and being like, look, he was with the NGO, so he's like, I'll take you through the humanitarian line with me. So just people like that just, they're like angels that come at these times when a lot of the times when you think that certain people are going to be there and they're not, other strangers appear. And I've always been very lucky in that. I've always had the right people show up for me at the right time, even if they're not people that I know. So, yeah, I do believe of angels.
So a quick, we could talk for hours, and we have in the past, both in front of a camera or not, Holly. I think people are getting even more of an appreciation for your perspective and your work, which is awesome, and that's what we want, because it deserves it. The final question that I'd like to ask you is this, all about James. I was asking this: what is the one thing about all of this that you think Americans need to better understand?
One thing about all of it. I would say that I think that it's hard to say what people would better understand, but I really just think, this is a situation, as we said, this can happen anywhere around the world. This can happen to anyone to different capacities. And I think that there's a certain obligation, I don't know if to use the word obligation, but a certain willingness that Americans may have in playing the role as people who stand up to bullies. And certainly in this case, this is what Russia is. It's a giant, dangerous, violent bully. And I think that, that's something America has always been notoriously good at, is defending those that need help. And you look at, again, some of the most vulnerable people in society, and the people that are being rescued from these places, and they're elderly, they're disabled, they're children, they're pets, they're animals. So, these are sort of the most vulnerable parts of our population. And I think that I wouldn't sleep very well if I just sort of turned a blind eye and said that that's not my problem because that belongs to a different part of the world, or that that child is less valuable because they belong to a different border than the children in my borders. So I think we, as Americans, as humans, I think that there's a part that we can all play to support those most in need.
Well, that's really important to hear. And I'll get some of those resources that you've seen their work, you've traveled with them, you can vouch for them being on the ground, actually providing help to those that are in need in a different way than others. Hollie, it's great to see you. When do you think, I said final question, but we did have some questions about, well, when, will you attempt to go back? Like people they kind of want a GPS on you after they meet you. They're like, when, just so they want to mentally prepare themselves for your next journey.
So it's not like a situation that you can kind of fly into and fly out. So there's certainly a lot more planning, time, logistics that has to go into the trips in and out, but it certainly will be a place that I expect that I will be going in and out of for quite some time. But I had thought of going back as soon as next week, but I don't know, probably need to take a little bit more time just because I want the story to really progress. I want the story to be, I don't want to be just churning the same stuff that I feel that I've already done, or I don't want to be repeating wire copy that you could easily read on the AP. So I think, I don't know how much things are going to change between now. Things can change by the day, but I think that, in maybe a couple of weeks, it's really hard to know. I'm just kind of keeping my finger on the pulse at the minute, but certainly we'll be back in the short term at some point.
Yes. Well, just a reminder for everybody, there's all sorts of ways that you can support Hollie. We're looking to support Hollie as best that we can through Smarter News, but Hollie has her own Substack. So if you go to Substack / it's Hollie S. McKay.
Yeah.
And you can sign up for Hollie's newsletter. And that's one way that directly supports Hollie. She also is an author. I forgot to mention that. War reporter, author, journalist, writer, all the things. And It's Only Cry for the Living is her book that was really focused on Syria. And that's a great way to support her. And you can actually buy that as well, which I will put in the comment sections. Hollie, you can go through Amazon. I know that's easy for everybody, but you could also buy it directly through a publisher that's an American publisher, a publisher that's run by a young female entrepreneur that's trying to revolutionize the book industry as well. So there's another way you can support Hollie, and there's second and third order effects of that. So it's great. So I'll put all of that down so people know how to support you. And we look forward to many more adventures and conversations, Hollie, with you in the future. But I'm glad you're back stateside. Hope you can get a little bit of rest. I know that's difficult, but we're so grateful for you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you, and I always appreciate the Smarter News audience. You always ask really great questions. You've been a great support to me, and it's really cool being able to collaborate.
It matters. All right, Hollie, we'll see you later. Get well. She has a little bit of cold, so we got to get vitamin C. We got to get her rested. And I'll see you soon. I'll just finish up here real quick. We'll make sure to get all that information for Hollie up on the website as well, so it's in a permanent place for you. I'll also include this on YouTube, and we'll load it to our podcast. And what I'll do in both of those situations, YouTube actually will be the easiest in conjunction with the website to list all the resources that Hollie wants to give us, and that way you have direct links if you'd like to help. I've actually was able to MC, because of Hollie, an event in New York for a group that she's seen do amazing work all over the world, but specifically in Afghanistan, providing hospitalization, medical services. And, these are the real deal, and that's something you could talk. Hollie's the real deal, and the places that she's worked with or she could vouch for are the real deal as well. A lot to think about there. So I'd be curious, coming away from this conversation, what questions and comments you have. Please go ahead and comment on social media. I know Hollie can jump on and answer some of them. But we're at an interesting point in the story, as Hollie mentioned. And I'm glad that we talked a little bit about the opinion that's happening. You're hearing a lot of debate. When breaking news goes down to lower volume, what goes up is commentary. Because these news organizations, and I know it because I worked in them, they have to fill time. And, you know, sometimes filling time is going to go down to hypothetics of, well, someone thinks this and someone thinks this, but it's not necessarily a conversation that's based on facts on the ground. And so recognize that that's happening in some of the news coverage right now, just as a means of sort of treading water, of wondering what's going to happen next. And what more can we say about this topic, and how does the story develop? In that way, it's a precarious spot, because the status quo that we mentioned at the beginning can stay. It can be a reality. You know, we think, well, no, this won't last for 6 months. It could last for 6 months. It could last for a couple of years. We could be seeing this for a couple of years. It's hard to think about that. Do we think about that going into Afghanistan or Iraq? This is a drastically different situation, but the potential is always there. So obviously, one of the big topics of conversation with President Biden overseas is, again, what are the off-ramps? What changes the dynamic? We know something that could be very well planned can change the dynamic, or a sudden miscalculation can change a dynamic in good ways and bad. And that's the story that we're in now. So we have to stay very close to the updates. And also, I'm not going to, you know, we were able to talk about it with a little bit with Holly. Some of you have asked in the past, well, why don't you cover more of, like, you know, what people are saying in different opinion voices? I think it's appropriate at certain times, but in general, I just want to give you the news. And being able to speak to someone like Hollie McKay is an unbelievable resource. I mean, there's nowhere else that you're going to sit down and hear from someone on the ground, that was on the ground in Ukraine. By the way, not once, but twice in the weeks leading up to the war, and then when the war kicked off. So invaluable experience there, and we're really grateful for Holly in so many ways. So send her all the good energy. You know, this was a very difficult decision to come back. And I know it's one that she's wrestled with, and she really pours herself into her work, and we're really excited about continuing to collaborate. So thanks for making that possible. I really appreciate that. So we have a bunch of other topics we're working on. One of them today, by the way, you're going to see on Smarter News, is a way that this story is coming closer to home, is that we have seen a record number of Russians and Ukrainians at the southern border. Yes, most of the people are still from Mexico, Central and South America. Well, when I say that it has significantly risen in the last 6 months, not just the last 6 weeks, last 6 months, that's a real interesting part of the story, and one that we're going to cover a little bit as we look through some of the other news related to it. So thank you again for all your support of smarternews.com, for making this dream a reality. And questions and comments, let me know. And as always, more on our website. Have a great day, guys. So grateful for you. I'll talk to you soon.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.